Welcome back. I'm Alan Hawes. This is Cypress Academy. Now we're going to dig through the iOS app and I'm going to show you the three pieces. The first piece is the storyboard. The storyboard is the view in the MVC. It controls the buttons that trigger each of the actions. It controls the two switches, one to turn on the LED and one to turn on the notifications. And it contains the label that represents the CapSense value. You start by copying the buttons onto your canvas or the labels onto your canvas or the switches onto your canvas. I've already done all of that in this example. There's a switch. You can just drag it on your screen. The first button is entitled Start Bluetooth, and then search for device, and then connect to device, and then discover services. You can see that the first one is blue. That means it's enabled, and you enable it through the property inspector. User interaction is enabled. So these buttons are not enabled. They're gray, which means if you touch them, they don't do anything. And as you recall from the demo, the first one will be blue, it'll be active, and then after the actions are done, I'll turn it off and I'll turn on the other one, and I do that with software, which I'm going to show you in the next step. So now I'll go to the Assistance Editor, and you can see that each of the buttons are connected into the view controller. So the Start Bluetooth button is connected to this IB outlet called Start Bluetooth button. The Search for Device is connected to the Search button. The Connect to Device is connected to the Connect Device button, etc. And you can see that each of the buttons have an action. The Start Bluetooth device has the Start Bluetooth action. So that's how the connection is made between the view and the view controller. Now I'm going to show you some more detail on the view controller. The first thing I've done is to find a global structure, which I call RC notifications. This structure just has a number of members: Bluetooth ready, found device, connection complete. These are just strings that I'll use to send notifications with. They're in reverse internet order: org.elkhorn-creek.simplecapsense.bluetooth-ready. This is so you don't accidentally collide with another notification that's going on in your system. Elkhorn Creek is actually in my backyard in Kentucky, and so I do a lot of my personal projects with elkhorn-creek.org. Inside of the view controller, the very first thing that I do is, when the view loads up for the first time, I tell the NS Notification Center, which is the Apple-provided iOS app that lets you listen for notifications from other models in your system, that I want to listen for the RC notifications.bluetooth-ready message. And when that message happens, I want to call self.bluetooth-on. So essentially what happens is, when the model sends out the message RC notifications.bluetooth-ready, I'll call the self.bluetooth-on. Self.bluetooth-on, what that function does is turns on the next button in the sequence. So each of these buttons will send a message back to the model. The model will talk to the CB Central Manager, which will do its thing. Then the model will be notified by the CB Central Manager through the delegation system that something has happened. When that happens, it'll send an NS notification that the view controller is listening to. So let's go slowly through these. The first one, as you'll recall, is the Start Bluetooth action. That's the first button at the top of the screen. When that happens, what you want is you want the model, which we're going to look at, to turn on the central manager. So let's flip to the model. So I'll click on the Bluetooth neighborhood, which is the class I created to represent the peripheral and to represent all of the Bluetooth world. And when the function is called Startup Central Manager from the view controller, all it does is it says give me a new CB Central Manager object. That object represents the Central Manager that's inside of the iOS. And then I'll store that in a local variable, which I'm calling Central Manager, which is of type CB Central Manager. So what happens is it tells iOS, go get it going. So the hardware will turn on, it'll start its thing, and then once it's going, it'll send the message back to the model called Central Manager did update state. So when that function is called by the CB Central Manager, I'll look at the different states that it gives me back. It can give me powered off, it can give me unknown, it can give me unsupported, it can give me resetting. All of those things are bad. The state that we're looking for is powered on. Once the CB Central Manager is powered on, I send the NS Notification Center a message called rcnotifications.bluetooth ready. What that does is it says, anybody who knows about this model, you should be aware that I've changed. And what's changed is the CB Central Manager is on and it's ready to have commands sent to it. Back in the view controller, when that happens, you registered that you want to call the function self.bluetooth on. So that calls self.bluetooth on, which enables the search button, which is the next button down on the screen. Then when the user presses the search button, it calls the action search action, which tells the model, the first thing it does is it tells the model, I want to discover the device. So back in the model, you can see the discover device function, and what it does is it says, Central Manager, start scanning for peripherals with services. And the service that I'm interested in is the BLE parameters.capsense LED service. Now you remember when we set up the BLE component, we created the custom service, and it had the UUID, which I called blah, 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 F0. Well, I copied that blah, 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 F0 into another global structure, which I call BLE parameters. And the first of the global structure parameters is the capsense LED service, which is a CBUUID, core Bluetooth, universally unique identifier that matches the hex code blah, 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 F0. And essentially what this does is it tells the CB Central Manager there's a lot of Bluetooth devices out there, and there may very well be a lot of Bluetooth devices out there. What it says is, I'm not interested in talking to those devices. I'm only interested in a device that is advertising that it supports this service. So what happens then is the CB Central Manager starts listening, and as soon as it hears a device like that, it calls me back, and it calls the function Central Manager did discover peripheral, and that calls me back with an object of CB peripheral type. Now, the CB peripheral is an object that represents a peripheral out in the world, and it doesn't know much about that peripheral other than what it heard in the advertising packet. So what I do is, if I'm not already connected, then I say that I found a new peripheral that's advertising those services. I save in a local variable that peripheral, so now I have a local reference to a peripheral that's advertising the correct services. And then I post a notification. I send out a notification to the view controller that I've now found a working device. And then I tell the CB Central Manager, stop scanning. Not interested in talking to anybody else. So what you could do is, if you were talking to more devices, you could have an array of these peripherals. I'm not doing that here. The first one I hear, that's the only one I'm going to talk to. Okay, inside of the storyboard, when the user presses connect to device, it triggers an action inside of the view controller called the connect device button. So it actually calls the connect device action, which turns off the connect button and tells the BLE object, our model, to actually make the connection to the device. Inside of our model, this says the connect to device function tells the Central Manager, go ahead and make a connection to that peripheral. Once the back and forth of the BLE radio protocol is complete, the central manager calls you back with, yep, I did connect to the peripheral. Once that happens, you can notify the view controller that you now have a complete connection. And I do that with the post notification of rcnotifications.connection complete. Inside of the view controller, when it hears that message, connection complete, it calls the connection complete method. The connection complete method turns on the services discovery button and turns on the disconnect button. Then once the user presses the discover services button, we go through another round. It calls the discover services action and disables the discover services button. Back in the model, in the Bluetooth neighborhood, when you call discover services, we've switched from calling CB central methods to calling CB peripheral methods. Once you have a connection established to make your communication to the specific peripheral happen, you don't call the central to make those happen, you call the peripheral to make those happen. So the first thing you do is you tell the peripheral, I'm interested in what services you've got to provide. That tells iOS BLE to go do the service discovery process. The BLE service discovery process talks with the BLE stack inside of the Cypress PSoC BLE, and they work out the back and forth communication to figure out what are the services that are available for use. When that process is complete, it calls this function peripheral did discover services. And what it does is it adds a list of CB services and it attaches those CB services to your peripheral object. You can then iterate over all of the services and you can look at each individual service. In our case, the service that we're looking for is the CapSense LED service, which I put into that global structure that I called BLE parameters, and I say, if the service UUID matches the CapSense LED service, then I want to save that service because I know that's the service that's going to have the two characteristics. I declared the CapSense LED service in the global structure BLE parameters, and as you'll recall, I called it blah, 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 F0. So here it is. That's the CapSense LED service. Once that's complete, the Discover Characteristics button is now turned blue because the user interaction is available. So the user, you or me or whoever, can press the Discover Characteristics button. When you press that button, it calls this Discover Characteristics action. And what that does is it tells the model, I'm interested in all of the characteristics that are associated with the CapSense service. So back in the model again, in the Bluetooth neighborhood, you can say that I say, have this function discover characteristics, which gets called from the view controller. And that function calls the CB peripheral method discover characteristics for service. And we're specifically interested in the characteristics that are associated with the CapSense LED service. That triggers the peripheral. It talks back and forth between the iOS and the peripheral. When that talking back and forth with BLE is complete, it calls this function peripheral did discover characteristics. And what will happen is your CB service will now have an array of CB characteristics associated with it. You can then scan through that array of characteristics and look at each characteristic. If the characteristics UUID matches the UUID of the characteristic you're interested in, you can save it. And in our case, we're interested in the two characteristics, the CapSense characteristic and the LED characteristic. And in my global table, I said the LED characteristic UUID is blah, 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 F1, and the CapSense characteristic UUID is blah, 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 F2. Once I've scanned through all of the characteristics I've found, I save a reference to the characteristic if it's the CapSense characteristic, and I save a reference to the LED characteristic if it's there. Once you've got all this back and forth done, You've got the BLE turned on, the central manager turned on. You found a device. You connected to the device. You found all the services on the device. You found the service, the specific service that matches the CapSense LED service. You discovered the characteristics that are associated with the CapSense LED service, specifically the LED service and the CapSense service. You now have a complete connection, and you can talk to individual characteristics. So I send out the notification, all of my characteristic scan is done. I have a complete connection. Now, if you remember on the storyboard, you've got two characteristics. You've got the red LED, it's got a switch associated with it, and you've got the CapSense, which has a label which starts as question marks, and notify. So let's start with the red LED. When the red LED switch is switched, it calls this function LED switch action. When the switch action is called, I ask the switch, is it on or is it off? If it's on, then I write the LED characteristic with 1, and if it's off, I write the LED characteristic with 0. Now notice that 1 and 0, those are magic numbers, which if you do in a project for me, I'll slap your hand, but we're expedient in this case. These write LED characteristics, they're just functions that are part of the model, and inside of the model, I do a BLE command when I get that call, and that BLE command is called write value. So I take either the 1 or the 0, I turn it into bytes with this NSData function, and then I write those bytes into the LED characteristic, and I ask for a write with response. You remember when we configured the BLE characteristic inside of the creator component, I said it was a read characteristic and a write characteristic. Write always means write with response. So I write with a response. That's it. The iOS CB peripheral and all the magic that's inside of the cell phone and all of the magic that is PSoC BLE talk back and forth, and then they trigger down in the firmware that write. So that's pretty cool. Now, the other thing we've got going on is the CapSense value. Now, we're interested in CapSense, a read from the device, essentially. And specifically, the read that we're interested in is the notification. So for us to get notifications back from our board, we need to tell our board that we're interested in notifications. So when this switch is switched, it calls an action in our view controller called the CapSense notify action. And all the CapSense notify action does is it calls the model and it says, please write the CapSense notify and tell it whatever the sender on is. Now, that switch, when it's on, it's true, and when it's off, it's false. So when it's on, we want notifications, and when it's off, we want no notifications. So when we look down inside of our model, we see that the write CapSense function that we called from our view controller takes in a Boolean, either the on or off, and then sends out a notification. Set notify is a member function of the peripheral class. And what it does is communicates with the peripheral that says, please turn on notifications so that I'll be notified when the CapSense changes. What happens then is the CapSense LED board that we built will start sending out changes. The iPhone hears those changes because it's connected, and when it hears the change, it calls this function peripheral did update value for characteristic. So when that happens, you look and see which characteristic changed. In this case, we were interested in the CapSense characteristic. So we got a note from the iOS. It said a value inside the characteristic changed. You say, which characteristic was it? It matches the CapSense characteristic. Then you have to unwind bytes. And so you do this little iOS rigmarole where you turn bytes that come in NSData into an integer. Then you save the value, and then you send out a notification to your view controller. The CapSense value has changed. Then, inside of the view controller, I told you that we registered a notification called Add Observer for Name, RC Notifications Update CapSense. And when you get this notification, you want to update the CapSense value on the screen. And all that you do down in your view controller is you ask your model, what's the value? You turn it into text, and then you put it on the screen. That's simple. So your board sends out the notification. It works its way through the Cypress BLE stack, out over the radio, into the iPhone, through the iPhone BLE stack. Then it calls your app back, says this characteristic changed. Then your characteristic sends the notification. The view controller reads the value that it saved locally, turns it into text, and puts it on the screen. That's it. So, once again, the model is the CB Central Manager as well as the peripheral that represents your board. The view controller takes button clicks and tells the model to do things, and when it gets notifications back from the board, it makes the display. That's all there is to it. I'll post this project and I'll post the firmware, and you're welcome to send me questions at allen_hawes@cypress.com.